I remember the exact moment my world started to crumble. It was a Monday morning, the office buzzing with its usual cold energy. But something felt different that day. I walked into the conference room, smiling politely at my coworkers, only to be met with whispers and glances that made my stomach twist. My manager, someone I had trusted completely, called me aside under the pretense of discussing a project. As soon as the door closed, the smiles vanished, replaced with a silence that weighed heavily on me. Then came the words I will never forget. "You're not cut out for this job. Maybe it's time you considered other options." My heart sank, a mixture of shock and disbelief. How could someone who praised my work yesterday treat me like this? Today I wanted to scream to defend myself, but the room felt smaller, suffocating, and I froze. The humiliation wasn't just in the words. It was in the way they looked at me, the way my colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Pretending not to notice, I walked back to my desk, head lowered, forcing myself to appear calm while inside. Anger bubbled quietly. I knew deep down I couldn't let this break me. Yet I also couldn't ignore it. That afternoon I overheard them discussing my failure, laughing about how I was so naive to believe I belonged there. It was the first time I realized that silence could be both a shield and a weapon. I chose silence that day. I didn't retaliate. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I left the office carrying the weight of betrayal in my chest, my mind racing with a single thought. They had no idea what they had just done. That night, alone in my apartment, I replayed every insult, every smirk, every comment. I let the hurt settle in, not to drown me, but to sharpen me. This wasn't just about a job. It was about my dignity, my self-respect. I promised myself I wouldn't make the mistake of reacting impulsively. They had humiliated me, but I would return stronger, smarter, and on my own terms. The first seed of determination was planted that night, and I knew the journey ahead would demand patience, strategy, and unwavering courage. The following weeks were a blur of quiet observation. I returned to work each day, maintaining a composed exterior while secretly documenting every slight, every whisper, every backhanded comment. I realized that surviving their games required more than endurance. It required intelligence. I began noticing patterns. Who spread the rumors, who exaggerated mistakes, and who stayed silent when I was undermined. Each detail became a piece of a larger puzzle, and I started mapping out a plan. My colleagues thought I was broken, that I had retreated into myself, but in reality, I was studying them, learning their weaknesses, their habits, and the ways they could be exposed. Outside work, I invested time in myself. I attended workshops, polished my skills, and expanded my professional network. I needed evidence, proof of my competence that they couldn't ignore. The more they humiliated me, the more focused I became on proving them wrong, not just to them, but to myself. I also realized the importance of emotional control. Anger could ruin everything. I had to master silence, let it work in my favor. Slowly, I started documenting everything. The emails, the conversations, the manipulations. I even reached out discreetly to a few trustworthy colleagues who had witnessed the injustices but feared retaliation. Their support became a quiet source of strength. By keeping meticulous records and staying composed, I created a shield no amount of gossip or humiliation could penetrate. Meanwhile, my confidence grew in ways they couldn't see. Each morning I walked into that office with a calm determination, knowing that my time to act would come. They continued their subtle attacks, underestimating me, believing I was just another weak target. But the seed I planted in Chapter 1 had grown roots, and with every insult, every unfair critique, my resolve strengthened. I was no longer the frightened woman who had walked in on that fateful Monday. The following weeks were a blur of quiet observation. I returned to work each day, maintaining a composed exterior while secretly documenting every slight, every whisper, every backhanded comment. I realized that surviving their games required more than endurance. It required intelligence. I began noticing patterns. Who spread the rumors, who exaggerated mistakes, and who stayed silent when I was undermined. Each detail became a piece of a larger puzzle. And I started mapping out a plan. My colleagues thought I was broken, that I had retreated into myself. But in reality, I was studying them, learning their weaknesses, their habits, and the ways they could be exposed. Outside work, I invested time in myself. I attended workshops, polished my skills, and expanded my professional network. I needed evidence, proof of my competence that they couldn't ignore. The more they humiliated me, the more focused I became on proving them wrong. Not just to them, but to myself. I also realized the importance of emotional control. Anger could ruin everything. I had to master silence, let it work in my favor. Slowly, I started documenting everything. The emails, the conversations, the manipulations. I even reached out discreetly to a few trustworthy colleagues who had witnessed the injustices, but feared retaliation. Their support became a quiet source of strength. By keeping meticulous records and staying composed, I created a shield no amount of gossip or humiliation could penetrate. Meanwhile, my confidence grew in ways they couldn't see. Each morning I walked into that office with a calm determination. Knowing that my time to act would come, they continued their subtle attacks, underestimating me, believing I was just another weak target. But the seed I planted in Chapter 1 had grown roots. And with every insult, every unfair critique, my resolve strengthened. I was no longer the frightened woman who had walked in on that fateful Monday. By the third month, I had transformed my approach completely. I no longer reacted emotionally. I became a quiet force. I noticed the subtle ways my manager tried to sabotage projects, the way colleagues took credit for my ideas. But instead of confronting them directly, I collected proof, screenshots, meeting notes, timelines, every detail meticulously recorded. I also strengthened relationships outside the office. Networking became more than a career move. It was a lifeline, a way to ensure I had allies who could vouch for my skills and integrity. I started volunteering for high-profile projects, carefully documenting successes that couldn't be disputed. Internally, I fought a battle of confidence. There were nights when I questioned myself, wondering if the humiliation had permanently damaged my reputation. But I refused to let those doubts win. I practiced affirmations, reminded myself of my achievements, and visualized the moment I would reclaim my power. The turning point came when a critical project I had been handling flawlessly was publicly criticized by my manager in front of senior leadership. The words were cutting, but this time I didn't flinch. Instead, I calmly presented data, proof of my work and the results, showing the reality versus the false narrative being spun. I noticed the subtle shock in the faces of those who had doubted me. For the first time, they saw cracks in their carefully constructed facade of authority. Privately, I knew I had planted the first seed of doubt in their minds. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was setting the stage for a comeback. My confidence grew daily as I continued to outperform expectations. Document every injustice and build alliances. The humiliation no longer defined me. It fueled me. I realized revenge didn't have to be dramatic. It could be calculated, elegant, and undeniable. The office that had once felt like a battlefield now became my proving ground. Each interaction, each meeting, each subtle victory contributed to a larger plan. I had learned to harness my pain, turning it into strategy, and deep down, I knew that the next chapters would bring the moment when all their underestimations and manipulations would collapse, and I would emerge not only unscathed, but triumphant. The pressure intensified as my manager began to notice my resilience. They increased scrutiny, hoping to catch me off guard, but I remained composed. Each attempt to undermine me became fodder for my strategy. I realized that the key to reclaiming control was visibility. I meticulously highlighted successes, shared credit fairly, and ensured that evidence of my competence reached the right people. The subtle sabotage continued. Emails misdirected, tasks reassigned without explanation, whispered criticisms, but I documented everything. My calm demeanor became my shield. While they expected panic or anger, I responded with professionalism. Outside observers began to notice. Colleagues, who had previously stayed silent, started acknowledging my contributions. It was a quiet vindication, one that fueled my determination. I also began to subtly test boundaries, proposing initiatives that showcase my skills while highlighting gaps in their leadership. The project presentations became a stage where my work spoke louder than any rumor or criticism. I watched as doubts began to surface among my detractors. The manager who had humiliated me now hesitated before criticizing, realizing I had evidence to counter every claim. Slowly, my influence grew, unnoticed by most, but felt by those in positions of power. I started mentoring newer employees, demonstrating leadership without arrogance, further building my credibility. It was no longer about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about proving that injustice and humiliation could not define a capable woman. The silent power I had cultivated became undeniable. Even small victories like subtle recognition from senior staff reinforced my belief in my approach. Each day I felt a sense of quiet triumph, knowing that my patience and strategy were working. They thought I had been broken, but I had been building an empire of confidence, integrity, and influence right under their noses. The emotional intensity grew not from confrontation, but from the realization that justice could be achieved without drama. Through intelligence, persistence, and unwavering self-respect, I knew the moment of ultimate reckoning was approaching, and I was ready to embrace it with grace. The turning point came when an opportunity arose that my manager couldn't control. A high-stakes project with senior executives required my leadership, and I seized it with precision. Every decision I made, every strategy one implemented showcased my expertise. My detractors tried subtle interference, but it only highlighted their incompetence when compared to my results. I presented detailed reports, forecasts, and solutions that left no room for doubt about my capabilities. Senior leadership began asking questions about previous criticisms, and I calmly provided documented evidence of my work and the unjust treatment I had endured. The room was silent, tension palpable as the truth became undeniable. I noticed colleagues who had once laughed at me now exchanging guilty glances. The humiliation they had inflicted was now mirrored back in subtle but profound ways. I didn't gloat or seek revenge publicly. I let the facts speak for themselves. Privately, I felt a surge of vindication. The power dynamic had shifted. I realized that true strength wasn't in retaliation, but in proving that integrity, intelligence, and perseverance could overcome manipulation and cruelty. The project's success not only cemented my professional reputation, but also empowered me emotionally. I no longer felt the sting of past humiliation. It had been transformed into fuel for growth. My allies, previously hesitant, now stood beside me openly, providing support and validation. I also began mentoring colleagues, showing them that resilience and strategy could triumph over injustice. Each action was deliberate, each decision calculated, and each moment reinforced the lesson that patience and intelligence were far more powerful than immediate emotional reactions. The workplace that had once been a site of fear and humiliation had now become a platform for my empowerment, a place where my confidence could shine unapologetically. The narrative was changing and I was in control. Every subtle smile from those who had doubted me felt like a quiet acknowledgement that I had won, not through aggression, but through strength, dignity, and unwavering resolve. As the weeks passed, my confidence soared. I had not only survived, but had built a reputation that could not be undermined. My manager, once so domineering, now approached me cautiously, aware that any misstep could expose them further. I maintained composure, never gloating, allowing my success to speak for itself. I also continued documenting every interaction, aware that the path of power was built on evidence and integrity. My colleagues who had previously been intimidated now sought my guidance, respect replacing fear. The subtle energy shift in the office was palpable. Those who had humiliated me were now hesitant, uncertain, while I moved with quiet authority. I also nurtured myself outside work, strengthening relationships, pursuing personal growth, and reflecting on the journey I had endured. Each morning I reminded myself of the resilience I had cultivated and the intelligence I had applied to turn adversity into triumph. Then came the moment I had been preparing for. A critical meeting with executives was scheduled to evaluate leadership performance, and I was invited to present my accomplishments alongside my manager. As I walked into the room, I felt no fear, only clarity and purpose. My presentation was flawless, highlighting successes, strategies, and growth metrics that left no room for doubt. When questions arose about past conflicts and alleged failures, I calmly provided documented evidence, exposing inconsistencies without accusation, letting the truth shine. The reactions were immediate. Executives exchanged looks of surprise, while my manager's confident facade cracked. Colleagues who had once laughed now nodded in silent approval. I felt a surge of vindication tempered with grace. This was not about revenge. It was about justice, recognition, and the undeniable strength of a woman who refused to be diminished. For the first time, I saw the balance restored, and the emotional weight I had carried for months began to lift. I had endured betrayal, humiliation, and silence, and had emerged not only victorious, but transformed. The lessons of patience, intelligence, and perseverance had crystallized into a powerful truth. No one could define my worth but me. The final chapter unfolded like the culmination of a long, carefully orchestrated journey. My manager, once dismissive and cruel, was confronted indirectly through undeniable evidence, leaving them with no credibility. Colleagues who had participated in the humiliation offered awkward apologies, some sincere, others self-preserving. I accepted them quietly, without gloating, understanding that forgiveness was a form of strength, not weakness. My reputation was restored not through drama or confrontation, but through resilience, strategic thinking, and unwavering self-respect. The project I had led became a benchmark for excellence in the company, and my leadership was recognized publicly for the first time. The emotional intensity one had carried for months transformed into a deep sense of empowerment. I realized that the humiliation, betrayal, and silence I had endured were not scars, but tools that had shaped me into a stronger, wiser, and more formidable woman. The office that had once been a battlefield now felt like a stage where my triumph could be quietly acknowledged and respected. Most importantly, I had learned that true revenge is not about breaking others. It is about elevating yourself beyond their cruelty. I had turned pain into purpose, weakness into strategy, and humiliation into opportunity. As I reflected on the journey, I understood that the most profound victory lay not in public acknowledgement, but in the quiet knowledge of my own strength. I had faced injustice, endured betrayal, and emerged victorious, not through force, but through intelligence, patience, and dignity. The final lesson was clear. No matter how cruel the world may seem, a woman who refuses to be diminished can rise stronger than ever, leaving those who doubted her in awe of her resilience. The story of my humiliation had become a story of empowerment, a testament to the power of silence, strategy, and unwavering self-worth.